Clean the floor. That's your job. Do it now. I'm not asking again.
There is a kind of cruelty that never announces itself. It does not arrive loudly. It does not come with a warning or an explanation, or even the decency of honesty about what it truly is. It arrives dressed in authority, wrapped in a job title, perfected over years of practice on people who had no power to push back against it. It is the cruelty of people who have made a quiet, private decision, one they would never say out loud in polite company, that certain human beings simply do not count, that certain people can be spoken to in any tone, handled in any manner, humiliated in front of witnesses, and discarded without a second thought, because the world they operate inside was built to protect them and not the people absorbing the damage. This story is about that cruelty, and it is about what happens when that cruelty makes the one mistake it can never recover from, when it chooses the wrong person to look through. Her name was Nia Caldwell. She was 32 years old, the only daughter of Raymond Caldwell, one of the most quietly powerful businessmen in the state of Georgia. She had grown up watching her father build something extraordinary from almost nothing, watching him turn a single maintenance contract into one of the most respected commercial property management companies in the American South. She had watched him do it with discipline, with integrity, and with a code of conduct toward the people who worked for him that he spoke about in every public address he ever gave, and, as far as Nia had ever known, honored in every private decision he ever made. She was proud of him in the way that goes bone deep, the kind of pride that becomes part of how you understand yourself and the standard you hold yourself to. And she had spent her entire life believing that the company bearing his name reflected the man she knew him to be. She was about to find out that belief was dangerously incomplete, and the person who showed her was the oldest friend she had in the world. Before we go any further into this story, we want to hear from you. Drop in the comments right now and let us know where you are watching from. We have viewers from all across the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and the Caribbean, and we love knowing where this community is coming from. And if you have not already hit that subscribe button, please do it right now so you never miss a single one of our upcoming videos. Now, let us get into this story, because it is one you are going to be thinking about long after it is over. Danielle Moore had known Nia Caldwell since they were 7 years old. They had grown up 3 houses apart on the same street in Southwest Atlanta, had attended the same elementary school, the same middle school, the same high school, had been so completely woven into each other's lives for so long that calling them best friends felt like an understatement. They were the kind of close that only develops between two people who have been through everything together, the losses and the failures and the embarrassing moments and the private triumphs that you only share with someone you trust completely. Danielle knew Nia the way you only know a person after 25 years of genuine friendship. She knew her silences and her habits and the particular way her voice changed when she was trying to be diplomatic about something she actually felt strongly about. And Nia knew Danielle the same way, which is exactly why, when Danielle called her on an ordinary Tuesday evening in early October, and her voice carried that particular flatness that meant she was holding something difficult together, Nia paid attention from the very first word. She asked Danielle what was wrong. What Danielle told her that night set into motion a chain of events that neither of them could have fully anticipated. A chain that would run for 6 months, pass through the hands of attorneys and investigators, and a father who did not take what he was shown calmly, and end in a reckoning that every single person inside Hargrove Tower would remember for the rest of their professional lives. Danielle had been working at Caldwell Property Solutions for 14 months when she made that call. She had taken a position in the administrative support department at Hargrove Tower. The company's flagship managed commercial property, a 32-story glass tower in Midtown Atlanta that housed 3 major corporate tenants and saw over 1,000 people through its doors every business day. She had taken the job because the pay was competitive, the location was practical, and because Raymond Caldwell's reputation as an employer was genuinely strong in Atlanta's professional community. People spoke about Caldwell Property Solutions as a company that treated its staff with dignity, a place where the culture matched the public brand. That reputation was a meaningful part of why Danielle applied, and for the first several months of her time there, her experience had broadly matched what she had been led to expect. The work was manageable. Her direct supervisor was professional. The environment was what it had been advertised as. But then the management structure shifted. A new regional director was brought in to oversee the Southeast Division. And within weeks, everything Danielle had been told about this company began coming apart in ways she had not seen coming, and did not know how to stop. She did not use the word bullying when she first described it to Nia. She said the environment had become difficult. She said the tone from leadership had shifted in a way that was hard to put precisely into words, but completely impossible to ignore once you were inside it every day. She said there were things happening inside that building, things she was witnessing daily, things being done to colleagues she had come to genuinely care about, that made her feel ashamed to be present for them and helpless to do anything about them. And as Nia kept asking questions in the quiet, patient, methodical way she had always had, the way that made people feel safe enough to say the thing they had been working themselves up to saying, Danielle got more specific. She described a regional director who spoke to staff in a tone that was deliberately designed to make them feel inferior. She described a property manager who had absorbed that director's example and applied it with an eagerness that suggested he had been waiting his entire career for someone to give him this kind of permission. She described watching the cleaning and maintenance staff, the people at the very bottom of the building's hierarchy, being treated in ways that went so far beyond professional discourtesy that the word difficult no longer came close to covering it. She described a woman having her name mispronounced in front of clients repeatedly, and being told, when she corrected it, that management would call her whatever was most convenient for them. She described a man pouring coffee on a freshly mopped floor and ordering the woman who had cleaned it to do it over again without ever once looking at her while he said it. She described workers being spoken about in the third person while they were standing in the room, as though the nature of their job had rendered them ineligible for the basic human courtesy of direct address. She described all of it clearly, specifically, and without exaggeration. And Nia listened to every word. And then she said something she would spend a long time afterward wishing she could take back. She told Danielle she believed her. And she meant that, or at least she meant it in the incomplete way that people mean things when belief is genuine, but filtered through an assumption they have not yet recognized as an assumption. In the same breath, she told Danielle that it was genuinely difficult for her to imagine that level of mistreatment happening systematically inside her father's company. Given everything she knew about how Raymond Caldwell operated, given the standards he had written into the foundation of the business, given the person she had watched him be her entire life, she was not calling Danielle a liar. She was not dismissing her account or telling her she was wrong. But there was something underneath those carefully worded sentences, some inherited confidence in her father's brand, some deep and unexamined certainty that the values he proclaimed at the top of his organization must have filtered down through every layer of it, that Danielle heard with perfect clarity. 25 years of friendship will do that. You learn to hear not just what a person says, but what they have decided before they open their mouth. Danielle heard it. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice or push back or do any of the things a person might reasonably do when they feel they are not being fully heard. She said she understood. She said goodnight. She hung up. And the particular quality of that silence, that quiet, resigned, I have heard this before quality from a woman who was not a quiet or resigned person, settled over Nia like something heavy and would not lift. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the dark and turned the conversation over and over, and the more she turned it, the more clearly she saw what she had done. She had let her image of her father's company speak louder than the direct account of someone who had been inside that company every single day for 14 months. She had let an assumption, comfortable, inherited, and completely untested, override the testimony of the person who knew her better than almost anyone alive and who had never once given her a reason to doubt her word. Danielle was not dramatic. She was not someone who called people at night to seek attention or sympathy or validation. The fact that she had called it all meant the situation had reached a point where she could no longer carry it in silence. And Nia had responded by making her feel, in the most polished and well-intentioned way possible, that she was not entirely believed. She picked up the phone before 7 the next morning and called Danielle back. She did not offer a long apology because that was not what Danielle needed. She said simply that she had not listened the right way the night before and that she was going to find out the truth herself. Not from a report, not from a meeting, not from any channel that ran through the management team that Danielle had described. She was going to find out the truth from the inside. Danielle was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked what Nia meant by that. Nia told her. And Danielle, who had known her for 25 years, said very softly that she hoped Nia understood what she was walking into. Nia said she did. She was not yet entirely right about that, but she was about to be. The plan she put together over the following 2 weeks was built on one principle that her years of corporate consulting work had taught her was almost always true, that the real culture of any organization is invisible from the top and perfectly legible from the bottom. The people who run companies see the version of their organizations that the layers beneath them have learned to present. The people who clean those companies' buildings see the version that nobody bothers to perform, because nobody in power has ever thought it mattered what the cleaning crew observed. Nia was going to become part of that cleaning crew. She was going to apply for a position on the overnight maintenance staff at Hargrove Tower under a false name, with a constructed identity that would hold up to a standard background check. And she was going to work that job, the actual job, the mopping and the scrubbing and the trash removal and all of the work that the people in the corner offices had decided was beneath their notice, for as long as it took to build a complete and honest picture of what was happening inside that building. She would have no corporate access, no executive privileges, no information that a regular cleaning staff member would not have. She was going in at the bottom and staying there, and she was going to document everything she found with a tool so ordinary that the people around her would never think to question it. The eyeglasses had been custom fitted by a private security professional Nia had worked with during a corporate investigation 3 years earlier. The frames were dark, slightly oversized, and looked exactly like the kind of reading glasses that a woman in her early 30s might wear if she spent long hours under artificial light. There was nothing remarkable about them. There was nothing that would cause a second glance from anyone in any hallway or break room or freight elevator in that building. Inside those frames, however, built so precisely into the structure of the glasses that no casual examination would reveal anything at all, was a high-definition wide-angle camera with a 12-hour battery life, a motion-sensitive recording function, and a wireless upload system that synced all captured footage to an encrypted private cloud account every time Nia came within range of a Wi-Fi network. The image quality was exceptional. The audio capture was clear enough to record a conversation held at normal speaking volume from across a room. And the glasses themselves were so completely unremarkable that in 6 months of daily wear inside Hargrove Tower, not one person ever commented on them, asked about them, or gave them a second look, because the people in that building had already decided that the woman wearing them was not worth looking at closely. They made that decision every single day. It was the most consequential decision any of them would ever make. She applied for the job under the name Diane Carter. She listed prior cleaning experience at a small property company in Birmingham, a reference she had carefully arranged to hold up, and submitted her application on a Tuesday morning. She received a call back on Thursday. She interviewed on Friday afternoon with a building operations coordinator named James, who asked her 4 questions in 11 minutes, spent most of the conversation looking at his phone, and told her she could start Monday on the overnight shift, 10 in the evening to 6 in the morning. Floors 18 through 24. Nobody looked at her closely. Nobody asked a question that required more than a surface answer. She was a body for a shift that needed to be filled, and the speed and carelessness with which she was hired told her something important about how the people running this division thought about the people working at this level. She showed up Monday evening at 9:45 in her gray uniform with her badge clipped to her chest and her glasses on her face, and she went to work. And from that first night, she began to understand why Danielle's voice had carried that particular flatness when she called. The woman who trained her that first night was named Deborah Washington. Deborah was 53 years old, originally from Macon, Georgia, and had been working the overnight shift at Hargrove Tower for 11 years. She was one of those people whose competence is so complete and so natural that it takes a moment to fully register. A woman who knew that building the way a surgeon knows a procedure she has performed 1,000 times, who could navigate its rhythms and its problems and its particular quirks in her sleep, and probably sometimes did. She taught Nia the supply room layout, the floor rotation schedule, the specific technique required to mop the marble in the main corridor without leaving streaks, and she delivered all of it in a calm, even voice that asked nothing in return except attention and effort. Nia paid close attention, not only to what Deborah was teaching her, but to Deborah herself, to the way she moved through the building when management was present versus when they were not, to the careful neutral expression she wore like a second uniform whenever certain people came within earshot, to the way she seemed to make herself physically smaller when passing a particular cluster of offices on the 22nd floor. Nia had spent a decade studying the behavior of people inside organizations under sustained stress. She knew exactly what she was looking at. And what she was looking at told her that whatever was happening in this building had been happening long enough to become the water everyone swam in. Long enough that people had stopped expecting anything different and had simply learned to survive inside it. The management team that ran the Southeast Division of Caldwell Property Solutions had been built almost entirely around one person. Her name was Sandra Voss. She was 47 years old, the regional director of operations for the division, and she had come to the company 18 months earlier carrying a resume that had impressed Raymond Caldwell's senior hiring team enough that they had brought her in on a strong salary with significant authority and almost no constraints on how she chose to exercise it. Sandra was immaculately put together in a way that communicated control over every variable within her reach. She spoke in meetings with the kind of measured, authoritative fluency that read, to people who did not know what they were looking at, as genuine leadership. She used words like excellence and standards and accountability in every conversation, every email, every performance review. She wielded those words consistently downward, always in the direction of the people least positioned to question whether she herself was living by them. Raymond Caldwell had hired Sandra Voss believing he was getting an operator who understood his values and would extend them through her division. What he had actually brought into his company was someone who had spent her career learning to perform those values convincingly enough that no one looked past the performance to check what was underneath. What was underneath would take 6 months and 200 hours of recorded footage to fully reveal. But Nia was patient. Nia had always been patient. The property manager directly beneath Sandra in the Hargrove Tower chain of command was a man named Marcus Elroy. Marcus was 38 years old and had been mediocre at every position he had ever held. Not dishonestly mediocre. Not the kind of mediocre that requires effort to conceal, but simply and straightforwardly the kind of man who coasted on the minimum required and had never encountered a professional environment that demanded more. Under Sandra Voss, he had discovered something that transformed him. He discovered that mediocrity was no obstacle to authority as long as you were willing to do whatever the person above you wanted done, as long as you were willing to be the instrument of her management style, the one who executed the tone she set in practice and in public. Under Sandra's modeling and with her implicit blessing, Marcus Elroy became the most direct and most frequent source of the mistreatment that Danielle had described on the phone that Tuesday evening. He was the one who poured the coffee. He was the one who threw documents. He was the one who spoke to members of the cleaning crew in a tone that a person of basic decency would not use toward a stranger on the street. And he did all of it openly, consistently, and without the slightest indication that he believed there would ever be any consequence for any of it. He was right about that, until he was not. The first incident that Nia's glasses recorded with full clarity happened in her third week. She was finishing the 19th floor corridor at approximately 11:30 in the evening when Marcus came through on what he called his quality walkthrough, a nightly circuit of several floors that was ostensibly about maintaining standards and was actually about reminding the overnight staff that they were being watched by someone with the power to make their lives harder. He walked the length of the corridor she had just mopped, stopped, looked at the floor without looking at Nia, and then poured the remaining contents of his coffee cup deliberately onto the wet marble surface. He did not look at her when he did it. He looked at the wall for a moment as though checking something, and then said, still without making eye contact, that the floor was streaking and needed to be done again. Then he walked back toward the elevator and was gone. Nia stood in that hallway for a moment. She looked at the coffee spreading slowly across the surface. She had spent 20 minutes cleaning. She looked at the corridor that was now going to need to be done again before the building opened in the morning. And then she reached for her mop, because that was what she was there to do. The glasses had captured his face, his voice, the angle of his arm, the deliberateness of the pour, and every word he said, in high definition and clear audio. She uploaded it that night from the parking garage before she drove home. It was the first of many. The document incident happened 4 weeks later and was witnessed by 6 people. Marcus had printed a stack of quarterly facilities reports on the 22nd floor conference room printer and apparently decided, for no reason that was ever made clear to anyone, that the reports needed to be physically carried to the supply coordinator's office on the floor below rather than taken there himself or sent electronically. He encountered Nia in the hallway outside the conference room, held the stack of papers toward her, and when she reached to take them from him, he released them before she had a proper grip. The entire stack, every page scattered across the hallway floor. He looked at the pages. He looked at Nia. And then, in front of 6-day shift staff members who were standing in that corridor and had no way to pretend they had not heard him, he said loudly and clearly that she needed to pick those up and that she was the most useless person on that floor. He did not wait for a response. He went back into the conference room. The 6 people in the corridor looked at Nia and then looked away in the particular way that bystanders look away from things they know are wrong and have decided are not their problem. Nia collected every page from the floor. She put them back in order. She carried them downstairs. The glasses recorded all of it, including the faces of the 6 people who watched and said nothing, which would later matter more than any of them anticipated. But it was not the things that happened to Nia personally that built the core of her case. It was what she witnessed happening to the people around her, the women who had been inside that building long before she arrived, and who would still be there long after any investigation concluded, the women who had no false name to retreat behind and no powerful father waiting for a phone call. There was Marguerite, 44 years old, originally from Haiti, 6 years with Caldwell Property Solutions without a single disciplinary mark on her record, and one of the most quietly exceptional workers Nia had ever observed in any professional environment. Marguerite was methodical and thorough and possessed of a warmth toward her colleagues that made the overnight hours feel less isolating for everyone who worked alongside her. Sandra Voss had been mispronouncing her name since the first day they had ever been in the same room. She called her Marguerite. The correct pronunciation is Marguerite. This is not a subtle distinction. Marguerite corrected her quietly and without confrontation on 3 separate occasions over several months. On the 4th occasion, a morning when Sandra was conducting a walkthrough of the 14th floor with 2 external clients present, Marguerite corrected her again in exactly the same quiet, measured tone she had used every other time. Sandra stopped walking. She looked at Marguerite for a moment with the expression of someone who has been mildly inconvenienced by something beneath their dignity to acknowledge. And then she said, in front of the clients and 3 other staff members and Marguerite herself, that she would call her whatever was easiest for her, and that Marguerite should focus on the floor because that was what she was there for. The clients said nothing. The staff members said nothing. Marguerite said nothing, but Nia's glasses were recording. And the expression on Marguerite's face in the moment after Sandra turned away, the expression of a woman who has just been told in public by the person with authority over her employment that her own name is an inconvenience, was captured with a clarity that no written complaint could ever have matched. There was Tasha, 31 years old, from Decatur, studying for her real estate license in the hours before her overnight shift began, one of the most quietly self-possessed people in the building. In her 8th month, Tasha made the mistake. And it was not a mistake. It was a federally protected activity. But inside Sandra Voss's division, it was treated as a mistake. Of discussing her hourly rate with a coworker. The National Labor Relations Act has protected workers' right to discuss wages with their colleagues since 1935. This is not a technicality or a loophole. It is a foundational protection of American labor law. Sandra Voss apparently considered it neither foundational nor relevant. When she found out that Tasha had discussed her wages, she called Tasha into her office and told her, with Marcus Elroy present as a witness, a detail whose significance would become clear later, that people who caused problems in her division did not get their contracts renewed. She did not reference any specific policy. She did not claim Tasha had violated any rule she could name. She simply made the message clear enough that its meaning was unmistakable. Tasha walked out of that meeting and never spoke freely to a coworker again. She resigned 6 weeks later. She told the exit interviewer it was for personal reasons. It was not for personal reasons. The glasses had captured none of that specific meeting because it happened behind a closed door. But Tasha would later tell her story to an employment attorney in considerable detail, and the attorney would use the word retaliation without hesitation. Then there was the fire safety drill, the incident that Nia would later describe to the attorneys as the one that moved the situation from a culture problem to a legal problem in terms she could not look past. The building's annual fire safety drill was scheduled for a Thursday morning in the 4th month of Nia's time at Hargrove Tower. All occupants were required to participate. This requirement was not ambiguous and not optional. It was a safety regulation, and compliance was the building management's legal responsibility. Marcus Elroy came through the overnight floor assignments the evening before the drill and told the cleaning crew, including Nia, including Deborah, including Marguerite, and two other women who had been with the company for years, that the drill was for the building's corporate tenants and day shift administrative staff, and that the overnight cleaning crew should remain on their assigned floors and continue working through it. He was telling a group of workers to stay inside a building during a fire drill because he had decided, without authority and without legal justification, that their participation was not required. This was a direct violation of OSHA regulations regarding emergency evacuation procedures. Nia reported it to no one that night. She stayed on her floor as instructed. And the glasses recorded Marcus delivering that instruction clearly, in his own voice, with enough specificity that no attorney who reviewed the footage would have any difficulty identifying what they were looking at. By the end of her 4th month, Nia had more than enough to present to an employment attorney. She had footage covering 11 separate OSHA violations, 4 incidents that attorneys would later classify as potential wage theft, 3 instances of what federal equal employment law defines as racially hostile work environment conduct, 1 clear NLRA violation in Tasha's case, and more hours of general documentation of daily mistreatment than anyone on her legal team would ultimately have time to review in full. But Nia did not call the attorneys yet. Because she had not yet answered the question her mother's failure, she corrected herself, her own failure, had put in front of her. She had not yet answered the question of how far up this went. She needed to know whether Sandra Voss was operating within a system that had enabled and protected her, or whether she was an outlier who had somehow slipped past the standards that Raymond Caldwell believed defined his company. She needed to know the difference, not for the attorneys, for her father. The close call happened in the 5th month. Marcus had been watching Nia, not because he suspected anything specific, but because she disturbed him in a way he could not fully articulate. Most of the overnight staff had learned to exhibit one of 2 patterns around management. Either a visible nervousness that confirmed the hierarchy in a way that management found reassuring, or a studied blankness that communicated submission by erasing any impression of individual personality. Nia did neither. She was calm, she was steady, she met eyes when spoken to without challenge, but also without the reflexive dropping of the gaze that management had come to expect. It unsettled Marcus without him knowing why. He began doing what people in his position do when they are unsettled. He began looking for a reason. He started coming back to floors he had already walked after he had told the overnight crew he was done for the evening. He started leaving and doubling back. On a Tuesday in the 5th month, he came back to the 21st floor at 1 in the morning, 2 hours after his walkthrough, and found Nia working on the floor above where she was scheduled because she had finished early and moved ahead. He stood in the corridor and looked at her for a moment that stretched long enough to be uncomfortable. Then he asked her why she was on floor 22 when she was assigned to floor 21. She looked at him directly and said she had finished floor 21 ahead of schedule and moved up to get a head start on the morning. He had no answer to that. He stood there for another moment, said nothing further, and left. But Nia noticed something in his expression in that hallway that stayed with her. A man who was only fully comfortable around people who were afraid of him had encountered someone who was not afraid of him, and it had produced in him not anger, but something closer to confusion. She drove home that night knowing she was running low on time. She needed one more thing before she was ready, and in the middle of her 5th month, she got it. It happened on a Wednesday evening before the night shift began. Nia arrived 20 minutes early, as she always did, and went to the basement break room to put her bag in her locker before heading to the supply room. She was the only one in the break room, or she thought she was, until she heard voices from around the partition wall. Sandra Voss and Marcus Elroy, speaking in the particular low but unguarded tone that people use when they believe they are completely alone. They were discussing a worker. The worker they were discussing was Marguerite. Sandra was telling Marcus that she wanted Marguerite gone before the end of the month, and Marcus was asking what grounds they would use. Sandra said they would build them. She said there had been the write-up from the named incident, the formal disciplinary notice she had filed after Marguerite corrected her pronunciation in front of the clients, and that they would add a performance documentation note dated retroactively to cover the previous quarter, and that with those 2 items on file, the termination would be defensible. Marcus asked if HR would push back. Sandra said Priya would process whatever she was given because Priya always processed whatever she was given. She said it with the calm confidence of someone describing a system they had tested many times and always found reliable. Nia stood perfectly still on the other side of that partition for the full 4 minutes and 23 seconds that the conversation lasted. The glasses recorded every word of it. When Sandra and Marcus left the break room, Nia sat down on the bench in front of her locker for a moment. Then she stood up, straightened her uniform, picked up her supply bag, and went upstairs to work her shift. That night, in the parking garage before she drove home, she made one phone call. She called her father. She did not tell Raymond Caldwell who she was calling from, or what name she was working under, or every detail of what she had spent 5 months documenting. She told him she needed to meet with him privately, that it was about the company, and that it was serious enough that it could not wait and could not happen over the phone. Raymond knew his daughter's voice the way parents know the voices of their children. In every register, in every key, in the particular frequency that means this is not ordinary. He cleared his schedule the next morning. They met at his house, not his office, because Nia asked him to keep it off the calendar. She sat across from him at the kitchen table where she had done her homework as a child, and she told him what she had been doing for 5 months. She told him all of it. Raymond Caldwell did not interrupt. He listened to his daughter the way he had always listened, completely, without filling the silences, and when she finished speaking he was quiet for a long time. Then he asked her to show him the footage. She opened her laptop and she showed him. She showed him the coffee on the floor. She showed him the documents scattered in the hallway. She showed him Marguerite's face in the moment after Sandra told her that her own name was an inconvenience. She showed him the fire drill instruction. And then she played him the break room recording. The 4 minutes and 23 seconds of Sandra Voss calmly planning the construction of false documentation to justify the termination of a woman who had worked faithfully for his company for 6 years, and whose only offense was correcting the mispronunciation of her own name. Raymond Caldwell watched all of it without speaking. When it was finished, he closed the laptop. He sat at his kitchen table and looked at his hands for a long moment. And then he looked up at Nia and said, in a voice that was quieter than she had expected and more controlled than she had feared, that he needed 72 hours. She told him to take them. He told her to go home and rest. Then he picked up his phone and called his attorney. What Raymond Caldwell did in the 72 hours that followed was not impulsive, and it was not emotional. Because Raymond Caldwell had spent 30 years in business learning that the most powerful responses are always the ones that are fully prepared before they are delivered. He spent the first 24 hours with his legal team reviewing every piece of footage Nia had captured, logging every incident, classifying every violation, building a complete evidentiary record that could survive scrutiny from every direction. He spent the next 24 hours coordinating with his senior HR leadership, people outside Sandra Voss's chain of command, people who reported directly to him and who had not been part of any process that Sandra's team had touched, to prepare the actions that needed to be taken simultaneously on the same morning so that no one inside the building would have the opportunity to prepare a story before the full picture was on the table. And he spent the final hours of those 72 preparing for a conversation that would take place inside Hargrove Tower on a Friday morning in the building's main conference room on the 4th floor at 9 o'clock sharp. A conversation that Sandra Voss and Marcus Elroy would be told was a routine divisional leadership review. And that was not remotely that. The morning of the confrontation, Nia arrived at Hargrove Tower at 8:45, not in a gray uniform. She arrived in a dark blazer with her hair pulled back and her laptop bag over her shoulder, and she walked through the main entrance, not the freight entrance that the overnight crew used, and took the main elevator to the 4th floor. The lobby security officer looked at her badge out of habit. The badge had her real name on it. He looked at the badge and then looked at her face and then looked at the badge again. She smiled at him and told him she was expected. She went upstairs. The conference room was already set up. A long table, chairs on both sides. Raymond Caldwell at the head of it with 2 attorneys on his left and the company's head of human resources on his right. Sandra Voss and Marcus Elroy arrived at 9 o'clock as instructed, came through the conference room door with the practiced composure of people who believed they were about to sit through a routine meeting, and stopped when they saw who was at the table. They stopped when they saw the attorneys. And they stopped, most completely, when they saw Nia, the woman in the gray uniform who had emptied their trash and mopped their floors and been called useless in front of witnesses, sitting at the conference table across from Raymond Caldwell's legal team, with a laptop open in front of her. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. Whatever calculation was happening behind his eyes, it did not find a satisfactory conclusion. He sat down because there was nothing else to do. Sandra sat down beside him with her face arranged in an expression of professional neutrality that took visible effort to maintain. Raymond Caldwell looked at them both. He did not raise his voice. He did not begin with accusation or anger or any of the theatrics that the moment might have seemed to call for. He said simply that he had something he wanted them to see and that he would like them to watch it carefully, and that there would be time for conversation afterward. Then he nodded to Nia, and she pressed play. They watched 14 minutes of footage. Not all 200 hours, 14 minutes, carefully selected by the legal team to represent, without ambiguity or room for alternative interpretation, the full range of what had been documented inside their building over the previous 5 months. They watched Marcus pour coffee on a clean floor without looking at the woman he was ordering to clean it again. They watched the documents fall in the corridor and heard his voice, clearly and without distortion, calling the woman who picked them up the most useless person on that floor in front of 6 witnesses. They watched Sandra tell Marguerite, in front of clients and colleagues, that her name was an inconvenience. They watched Marcus deliver the fire drill instruction to a group of workers who by law had every right to participate in that drill. And then they watched the break room. They watched themselves. They listened to Sandra's voice, her own voice, her actual voice, the voice she used when she believed she was completely alone, planning the construction of false documentation to justify the termination of a woman who had done nothing wrong. When the 14 minutes were over, the room was completely silent. Sandra's professional neutrality had not survived the experience. She was looking at the table. Marcus was looking at the wall. Raymond Caldwell let the silence sit for a moment, then he spoke. He said that he had spent 30 years building a company on the premise that every person who walked through his doors, regardless of their title, regardless of the nature of their work, regardless of any factor other than their basic humanity, deserved to be treated with dignity. He said that premise was not decorative. It was not something he had written into his company culture documents for the sake of a good impression. It was the reason the company existed in the form it did, and it was the standard against which every person who held authority inside that company was going to be measured. He said he had now seen, in their own voices and on their own faces, evidence that they had not met that standard. He said he had also seen evidence of OSHA violations, potential wage theft, retaliation against a protected employee activity, and the deliberate falsification of performance records to justify a termination, and that all of that evidence was now in the hands of his legal team and would be handled accordingly. He said he had 2 things to tell them, and he would like them to listen carefully to both. The first was that their employment with Caldwell Property Solutions was terminated, effective immediately, for cause, and that their building access had already been revoked before they entered the room that morning. The second was that they should retain attorneys of their own before the end of the business day. Then he stood up, and he said, without raising his voice, without drama, without anything, except the particular weight of a man who had built something real and had just watched people he trusted attempt to corrupt it from the inside. He said that he hoped the next place they worked would give them an opportunity to make different choices. Then he left the room. The attorney stayed to handle the paperwork. Nia closed her laptop. She looked at Sandra Voss and Marcus Elroy one final time. She did not say anything. She did not need to. She stood up, picked up her bag, and walked out. What happened in the weeks that followed moved on several tracks simultaneously, the way these things always do when the evidence is extensive and the violations are serious. On the legal track, Raymond Caldwell's attorneys filed formal complaints with the Occupational Safety and Health Administration covering the 11 documented safety violations, including the fire drill instruction that had placed an entire overnight crew in potential danger. OSHA opened an investigation. The findings that came back confirmed the violations and resulted in significant penalties that the company paid and documented publicly as part of a commitment to transparency that Raymond Caldwell insisted on, even though his attorneys advised him he had the option of keeping the settlement private. He did not keep it private. He believed his workers deserved to know that what had been done in that building had been acknowledged at the highest level and addressed with consequences that matched the seriousness of what had occurred. On the employment law track, the wage theft review conducted by an independent accounting firm with access to 4 years of payroll records across Sandra Voss's division identified irregularities affecting 23 workers over an 18-month period. Back pay was calculated, confirmed, and distributed to every affected employee before the end of the following quarter. No one was asked to sign anything in exchange for receiving money they had already earned, and that had been wrongfully withheld from them. Marguerite's situation was handled personally by Raymond Caldwell. He called her himself, not through an assistant, not through HR, but himself from his own phone on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the confrontation in the conference room. He told her that her termination had been the result of a deliberate falsification of her performance record, that it had been carried out by people who were no longer with the company, that every trace of it had been removed from her file, and that her 6-year tenure with Caldwell Property Solutions would be restored in the company's records, as though the termination had never occurred. He told her that her position was available to her if she wanted it, with full back pay covering every week she had been out of work. He told her he was sorry. He told her that the company had failed her and that he had failed her, and that he understood if she chose not to come back. Marguerite was quiet on the phone for a long moment. Then she said she would think about it. She came back 2 weeks later. She was at her locker on her first morning, back when Deborah Washington came through the break room door, saw standing there, and without saying a word, put down what she was carrying and hugged her. The break room was full of people. Nobody said anything because nobody needed to. Some things do not require words to be completely understood. Tasha's situation was handled through the legal team. The NLRA violation in her case, the retaliatory conversation in which Marcus Elroy had been present while Sandra Voss warned her that discussing wages could cost her contract renewal, was documented through Tasha's own account, corroborated by Marcus's presence as an identified witness and by the broader pattern of conduct established through Nia's recordings. Tasha received a settlement that her attorney described as fair and that covered the income she had lost in the months since her resignation. She did not return to Caldwell Property Solutions. She had built something of her own in the intervening months. The real estate license she had been studying for was close to completion, and the chapter of her life that included that building was one she was ready to close. But she accepted the acknowledgement. She had spent over a year believing that what had been done to her would simply be absorbed into the silence, that it would join the long list of things that happen to people without power and are never addressed because addressing them requires someone with power to care enough to act. It had not joined that list, and that mattered to her in a way that the settlement money, though meaningful, did not fully capture. Priya Hutchins, the HR coordinator who had spent 2 years processing whatever Sandra Voss put in front of her and telling herself that her discomfort was a substitute for action, was not terminated. This was a decision that Raymond Caldwell and his legal team discussed at length, because the argument for terminating her was not without merit. She had known what was happening. She had processed the false documentation in Marguerite's case without flagging it. She had filed the retaliatory write-up without questioning its basis. She had been, in the most practical and consequential sense, the administrative machinery through which the mistreatment of dozens of people had been made to look official and documented and defensible. She had enabled it. But Raymond Caldwell made a distinction, one his attorneys respected even as they noted it, between the person who designs the system and the person who, through weakness and fear and a failure of moral courage, rather than through any active cruelty, becomes the system's instrument. Priya Hutchins had not been cruel. She had been compliant. And compliant people, Raymond believed, were sometimes capable of becoming something different when the environment around them changed and when they were shown clearly and specifically what their compliance had cost. He gave her that chance. She was required to complete 60 hours of employment law and ethics training. She was reassigned to a different division under direct oversight, and she cooperated with the legal team's review so completely and so thoroughly, providing internal documentation, email records, and her own detailed account events dating back 18 months, that 2 of the 3 attorneys on the case later said her cooperation had strengthened the evidentiary record in ways that were significant. She stayed with the company. Whether she became a different professional in the years that followed is something only the people who worked alongside her would be able to answer. But she was given the chance. Most people who did what she did are not. Sandra Voss retained an attorney the afternoon of the confrontation, as Raymond Caldwell had advised her to do. Her attorney filed a wrongful termination claim 6 weeks later, arguing that the recordings obtained by Nia had been gathered without proper consent and were therefore inadmissible as grounds for termination. The argument went nowhere. Georgia is a one-party consent state, meaning that any participant in a conversation may legally record that conversation without informing the other parties. And Nia had been a participant in every conversation her glasses had captured. The footage was legal, it was admissible, and it was, in the professional assessment of every attorney who reviewed it, overwhelming. The wrongful termination claim was withdrawn before it reached any formal proceeding. The civil litigation stemming from the wage theft findings and the retaliatory termination of Marguerite continued on a separate track and reached a settlement that the company disclosed publicly, again at Raymond Caldwell's insistence, because he believed that the people who had been harmed deserved to know that the harm had been formally acknowledged and resolved in a way that reflected its actual seriousness. Marcus Elroy hired his own attorney, filed his own wrongful termination claim, and watched it meet the same outcome as Sandra's for the same reasons. The OSHA findings remained on record. The federal documentation of the NLRA violation remained on record. Both of them carried those records into whatever professional lives came next. Danielle Moore found out what Nia had actually been doing on the same morning that the confrontation happened at Hargrove Tower. Nia called her from the building lobby at 9:40, 20 minutes before she went upstairs to the conference room, and told her everything. The 5 months, the false name, the glasses, the recordings, the break room conversation, all of it. There was a silence on Danielle's end of the line that lasted long enough that Nia asked if she was still there. Danielle said she was there. She said she was trying to find the words for what she was feeling. She said she did not know whether to be overwhelmed or relieved or grateful or all three at once. Nia told her she did not have to pick. Then she told Danielle one more thing, that the night Danielle had called her and described what was happening in that building, and Nia had responded the way she had let her friend down. She said that out loud, clearly without softening it. Danielle was quiet for a moment. Then she said that what Nia had done in the 5 months that followed was the most complete apology she had ever received from anyone in her life. They were both quiet for a moment after that. Then Nia said she needed to go upstairs. Danielle told her to go. She told her she was proud of her. Nia told her the feeling was mutual. Then she took the elevator to the 4th floor, walked into the conference room, opened her laptop, and let the truth speak for itself. Raymond Caldwell made several structural changes to Caldwell Property Solutions in the months that followed, changes that he described publicly as not cosmetic and not reactive, but as the kind of long overdue reckoning that a leader owes his organization and the people inside it when he discovers that the gap between the values he proclaimed and the reality his people were living inside had grown wide enough to allow serious harm to occur. He created an independent employee relations office with a direct reporting line to his office and no connection to any regional management chain. An office whose sole function was to receive, investigate, and respond to reports of mistreatment, harassment, and misconduct from any employee at any level of the company. He commissioned an independent audit of the HR practices across all 14 states in which the company operated, with findings that were shared with him and with the company's board without filtering through any internal management layer. He implemented a mandatory frontline experience requirement for all managers above a certain level, an annual program in which managers spent time in frontline roles, not as an exercise in humility theater, but as a genuine attempt to close the perceptual gap between the people making decisions about the cleaning crew and the people on the cleaning crew. And he made one more change that was smaller and quieter than any of the others, but that said something, in Nia's opinion, more clearly than all the structural reforms combined. He changed the sign on the freight elevator at Hargrove Tower. For years, that elevator had been designated for maintenance and cleaning staff, a designation that had been used by Marcus Elroy and others as a tool of separation, a daily reminder of hierarchy that said without words that certain people belonged in certain places and certain other people belonged somewhere out of sight. Raymond Caldwell had the freight designation removed. All elevators in Hargrove Tower became available to all staff. It was a small thing. It cost nothing. And the people who had been told for years to use the freight entrance, who had been told in the most architectural and mundane way possible that their presence in the main spaces of the building was unwelcome, noticed it immediately. Deborah Washington noticed it on her first morning back after the changes went into effect. She took the main elevator. She did not make a speech about it or call anyone to say what she had done. She simply rode the elevator up to her floor, got her supplies from the closet, and went to work. That was enough. There is a question that this story seems to invite, a question about what justice actually looks like when it arrives, about whether what happened to the people responsible for those months of mistreatment constitutes anything like a sufficient answer to what they did. Sandra Voss lost her job. Marcus Elroy lost his. They both faced legal proceedings that reached unfavorable conclusions. Their professional reputations in the facilities management industry, where word travels in specific and lasting ways, were marked by what had been publicly documented about their conduct. These are real consequences. But Marguerite had already lived through a wrongful termination and the weeks of uncertainty and financial stress that followed it before the recordings were reviewed and the decision was reversed. Tasha had already spent months in silence, already resigned, already absorbed the message that speaking up leads nowhere. The 23 workers who had been shorted on wages had already lived through those months of being paid less than they had earned. And all of the women who had spent those years making themselves smaller in the hallways of a building owned by a man who had built his company on the promise that every worker deserved dignity. They had already lived through all of that before any glasses recorded anything, before any attorney reviewed anything, before any conference room confrontation happened on a Friday morning at 9 o'clock. The reckoning happened, but the harm preceded it, and that sequence, harm first, reckoning later if ever, is not unique to this story. It is the structure of almost every story like this one. What makes this story different is not the outcome. Outcomes like this one, the exposure, the accountability, the reforms, are rarer than they should be but not unheard of. What makes this story different is the person who created the conditions for the outcome. A woman who had every reason to look at a painful situation from a comfortable distance chose to put on a gray uniform and go inside it. She did not do it for credit. She did not do it to be the hero of someone else's story. She did it because her oldest friend had told her something true and she had not fully believed it, and that failure, that small, human, entirely understandable failure, had bothered her enough that she could not rest until she had made it right. Everything else that followed, the recordings, the legal proceedings, the confrontation, the reforms, all of it traces back to a phone call between two women who had known each other since they were 7 years old, and one of them deciding that what the other had told her deserved more than half a belief. The lesson in that is not about hidden cameras or legal strategy or corporate accountability structures, though all of those things matter. The lesson is about what happens when someone with power over a situation decides that the people without power over it are worth the full weight of their attention. That decision, small, personal, made in the dark of a sleepless night, is where this whole story actually began. Everything else was just what happened when one person decided that the truth was worth going looking for, even if going looking for it meant mopping floors at 5 in the morning in a building that her father owned, in a uniform that made her invisible, wearing a pair of glasses that recorded everything she was not supposed to see. They humiliated the wrong janitor. They spoke past her and over her and around her and about her as though she were not in the room. They poured coffee on her floors and threw papers at her feet and told her she was the most replaceable person in the building. They did all of it in front of witnesses, in front of colleagues, in front of the woman cleaning the office. They were too important to clean themselves. They did all of it with complete confidence that it would cost them nothing because it had never cost anyone anything before. And because the person they were doing it to was wearing a gray uniform and pushing a cart and had no name that mattered in their world. They were right about almost all of it. They were wrong about the last part. Her name was Nia Caldwell, and it mattered more than they will ever fully understand. Now I want to hear from you. Drop in the comments right now and tell me, when Danielle called Nia that night and Nia did not fully believe her, what would you have done? Would you have pushed harder? Would you have let it go? And here is the bigger question I want you to sit with. How many Daniellas are there in workplaces right now? Calling someone who half believes them and then going quiet. How many people are doing that job, in that uniform, in that freight elevator, absorbing that treatment because nobody with power has looked closely enough to see it? Tell me in the comments. And tell me where you are watching from. We have an incredible community of viewers right across the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and the Caribbean, and we love knowing where this family is tuning in from. If this story moved you in any way, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, please do that right now, because the stories we tell here are the kind that stay with you. The next one is already coming, and I promise you it is worth waiting for.